Boris Johnson announces the end of COVID mandates in the UK. Canadian truckers block traffic in protest of their government. The CDC acknowledges more conspiracy theories are true. And are Americans being denied healthcare based on their vaccination status? Welcome to Old Foundry Media. I'm your host, The Crane Man. Let's fire it up. I'll begin with this article from the Millennial that is headlined, "It's Over. England Drops Vaccine Passports, Mask Mandates, and Work Restrictions." Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced an end to COVID restrictions in England, including face masks in public places and vaccine passports. Johnson said on Wednesday that the government would end its advisory telling people to work from home. This comes after Johnson has been slammed in the press for attending parties while the rest of the nation was in lockdown, and Queen Elizabeth sat masked and socially distanced at the funeral for her husband, Prince Philip. Johnson warned that while the country should be proud, that this is not a guaranteed finish line for the pandemic, as future variants could become a factor. "We must learn to live with COVID in the same way we live with flu," said Johnson. According to the BBC, mandatory COVID passports for entering nightclubs and large events would end, though organizations could choose to use the NHS COVID pass if they wished. People would no longer be advised to work from home and should discuss their return to offices with employers. Face masks will no longer be mandated, though people are still advised to wear coverings in enclosed or crowded spaces when meeting strangers. From Thursday, secondary school pupils will no longer have to wear face masks in classrooms, and government guidance on their use in communal areas would be removed shortly. But you can hear this in Prime Minister Boris Johnson's own words.
But we will end the compulsory use of COVID status certification in England. From now on, the government is no longer asking people to work from home. The government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks anywhere.
Who would have thought Britain would be the first Western country to snap out of their psychosis? Checking in on our friends to the north in Canada, we see that they are going the opposite direction, sadly. Here's a poster calling for Canadian truckers to converge on Ottawa and blockade Parliament to protest the Canadian government's vaccine mandates for all truck drivers. The following clip shows Canadian truckers blocking all lanes to and from Canada and the United States in protest of the vaccine mandate.
There's mandate freedom right there. There's Rick's truck. We just did the interview with him just in front of his truck there.
Oh, and don't forget to pump the children full of anti-vax propaganda that teaches them to consider their neighbors as dangerous and to have them arrested.
Puis qu'est-ce qu'on devrait faire avec les gens qui veulent pas se faire vacciner?
On devrait appeler la police.
Oui.
S'ils n'ont pas leur vaccin, ça peut mettre beaucoup de personnes en danger. Fait que comme le gouvernement est en train de faire en ce moment, il faut leur couper petite chose à petite jusqu'à temps qu'ils se tannent puis qu'ils se fassent vacciner.
En tout cas, on a des futurs politiciens à côté de nous. Merci.
And you should make sure children know how dangerous their neighbors are, even though the creators of the vaccine, the CDC, and reality itself have all said that the vaccines do not prevent the transmission of COVID-19. Next, we'll look at what American institutions are up to concerning COVID-19. But before we do, I want to play a clip of Rand Paul from September of 2021.
Mr. Becerra, are you familiar with an Israeli study that had 2.5 million patients and found that the vaccinated group was actually 7 times more likely to get infected with COVID than the people who had gotten COVID naturally?
Senator, I'd have to get back to you on that one. I'm not familiar with that study.
Well, you think you might want to be if you're going to travel the country insulting the millions of Americans.
Here's an article from Bloomberg stating a CDC study now acknowledges immunity from prior COVID infection. This was considered a conspiracy theory and misinformation just a short time ago. The article says prior COVID cases gave more immunity than shots as Delta rose. Prior infection with COVID-19 gave at least as much protection from a repeat bout of the coronavirus as vaccination during the rise of the Delta variant, according to a U.S. government study. Before Delta arose last summer, vaccinated people with no previous cases were about half as likely to be diagnosed with COVID as unvaccinated people who'd had the disease earlier, according to a U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention analysis of data from California and New York. After Delta became dominant in late June and July, those with prior cases alone were better protected than those who'd only received vaccines without an earlier infection. CNN covered the same CDC study, but their headline is hilariously different from the previous article, and is shown to be wholly false by the text contained within the CNN article itself. The headline reads, "Vaccination protects against COVID-19 hospitalization significantly more than prior infection, according to CDC study." As we can see in this paragraph, experts first looked at previous infections confirmed with a laboratory test by the spring of 2021, when the Alpha variant was predominant across the country. Before the Delta variant, COVID-19 vaccination resulted in better protection against subsequent infection than surviving a previous infection. When looking at the summer and fall of 2021, when Delta became the dominant strain in the country, however, surviving a previous infection now provided greater protection against subsequent infection than vaccination. Dr. Benjamin Silk, lead for CDC's surveillance and analytics on the Epi Task Force, said on a call with Media Wednesday. The paragraph I just read is saying the opposite of what the headline says, pretty plainly, but that's good old CNN for you.
Listen. The unvaccinated people in the U.S. are key to the reason that coronavirus, the variants are emerging. They should not be part of polite society, so to speak. We have to start doing things for the greater good of society and not for idiots who think that they can do their own research or that they are above the law and they can break the rules.
Some American companies are quietly acknowledging the crumbling of the vaccine narrative. This article from the Post-Millennial says, Starbucks has become the next major company to drop their vaccine mandate after the Supreme Court ruling earlier this month on Biden's vaccine and testing requirements for large private businesses. The company announced this policy reversal in a memo sent to employees on Tuesday, according to the Associated Press. Interestingly, some companies are instituting their own mandates to replace the ones struck down by the Supreme Court. This article from the Washington Times tells us about Carhartt's decision. It says, "The Carhartt apparel company is the latest to find itself in the middle of the COVID-19 wars. After an internal memo informed employees the company would forge ahead with its vaccine mandate, despite a Supreme Court ruling striking down President Biden's testing requirement on unvaccinated workers." In a letter that circulated online, CEO Mark Valade said workplace safety is key and the ruling doesn't impact that core value. It also said an unvaccinated workforce represents a risk the company is unwilling to take. The letter kicked up dust in the Twitterverse, with hashtag boycott Carhartt trending for days, while some said they'd doubled down on orders in support of the company. It will be interesting to see if this move works out for Carhartt. With a boycott movement trending on Twitter, the reaction thus far looks to be mostly negative. In a Getter post, Representative Matt Gaetz of the Free State of Florida writes, "Nowhere in America should the government or businesses have the power to medically segregate based on vaccination status." I couldn't agree more, and the reason for that is because of what you can hear in the following clip, where a man is being denied a kidney transplant because he is not vaccinated.
Our policy is in order to have people active on the transplant list and get a transplant, you need to be fully vaccinated. So you don't want to move forward?
I'd rather die of kidney failure than get it.
Okay. So this may be a crossroads at your evaluation, because there's not going to be any exception to that. The science is pretty clear on the vaccine.
And I just had COVID and I got over it. I'm not scared of it. It doesn't matter. It's like you have a 99.99997% chance to survive. I'm not like requiring a vaccine. And
that's all pretty inaccurate data, but it's obviously your choice, but it's not your choice if you want to be active on the list.
In this Getter post, we see Juanita Broderick saying, "Proof of citizenship scares the hell out of Democrats," and Tanya replying with, "But proof of vaccination doesn't." Democrats are insulting masses of people lately by referring to voter ID laws as Jim Crow 2.0. But given the disproportionate effect their vaccine mandates have on black people, and how they are literally segregating people, I have come to the conclusion that the only thing akin to a Jim Crow 2.0 going on right now in America is their vaccine policy. Let me know if you think my conclusion is correct in the comments. As was shown earlier in the video with Rand Paul talking about natural immunity months before the CDC acknowledged it, the hegemony has a tendency to be a bit behind on their information. Eric captures this sentiment in his Getter post, asking, "Did it really take 2 years for the left to even flirt with the idea that masks don't work?" "End this charade immediately," he says. I'll end with this image, because it displays the mental gymnastics required to sustain the hegemony's narrative at this point. Big thanks to my subscribers and commenters. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. This is the Crane Man punching out.